The auctioneer's voice rang out over the crowd, sharp and commanding, his gavel striking the worn wooden block with authority. A hush fell over the gathering of farmers, ranchers, and spectators, all eyes trained on the next horse to be sold. "Next up, Havoc," he called, his tone both warning and amused. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind of hushed whispers that usually followed a horse with a reputation. Some men exchanged skeptical glances. Others smirked, certain they knew exactly what they were about to witness. Havoc wasn't just any horse. He was a beast, coal-black and towering in stature, with muscles that rippled under his shiny coat like armor. He was a striking figure, yes, but it wasn't his size that made the crowd uneasy. It was his eyes, wild, furious, searching the crowd with a frantic energy that suggested he was constantly on the lookout for escape. "Don't be fooled by his looks," the auctioneer warned, his voice laced with mockery. "He's broken more fences and bones than I care to count. Untrainable, a real problem horse." There was a pause, a palpable hesitation, and then, to everyone's surprise, a hand shot up from the back. 200! Grant Holloway's voice rang out clearly, cutting through the murmur of disbelief that spread through the crowd. The whispers grew louder. "Holloway's lost it," one man muttered. "That horse will eat him alive," another chuckled. But Grant's face remained stoic, unwavering, even as the auctioneer's gaze flickered to him with a mix of pity and amusement. Havoc, however, was a different story. His wild eyes locked onto Grant's, and in that brief moment, something shifted. There was more there than just rage. Was it fear? As the auction came to a close, the horse was finally sold to Grant, who paid no mind to the chuckles or judgment from the crowd. Havoc's past, filled with brutality and torment, was written in every nervous twitch and sharp glance he made. But for Grant, it was something more. A challenge, yes, but a challenge that he intended to face head-on. The truck rattled down the dirt path towards the Holloway farm, the trailer behind it creaking as it struggled to keep pace with the restless movements of Havoc. As the vehicle came to a halt, the ramp dropped with a loud thud, and in the blink of an eye, Havoc exploded out of the trailer. His hooves struck the ground with such force that it felt as if the earth itself trembled beneath him. "Grant, are you out of your mind?" Mara's voice was sharp, filled with frustration. She stood at the edge of the barn, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a mix of disbelief and concern. "You've brought a disaster onto our property." Owen, their teenage son, stood a few feet behind her, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and trepidation. "He's huge," he whispered, his voice carrying a blend of fascination and fear. Grant, however, remained focused, his face unreadable as he approached the paddock with deliberate, calm steps. Havoc's massive form shifted in place, his nostrils flaring, ears flicking at every sound. When Grant stepped closer, the horse reared slightly, his powerful front hooves slashing the air as though to warn him away. "Easy, boy. Easy now," Grant murmured, his voice low and steady. Havoc's eyes flashed with fury, but surprisingly, he didn't lunge. Instead, he seemed to pause, sizing up the man who stood before him, perhaps curious, perhaps cautious. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through with a knife, and for a long moment, the two locked eyes, neither one willing to back down. Moments later, chaos erupted. Havoc surged forward, his body moving with terrifying speed, and slammed into the paddock gate with a force that splintered the wooden beam. The noise sent the other horses in the nearby corral into a frenzy, their frightened whinnies filling the air as they scattered in every direction. Mara's voice cut through the commotion, sharp and furious. "I've got this," she shouted, but Grant, with his steady determination, called back over his shoulder. "I've got it, Mara." Yet even as Grant wrestled to maintain control, Havoc's unrelenting energy began to spill over. The once peaceful farm was now a battlefield, the air charged with a palpable force as the massive horse fought against every attempt to contain him. That night, the winds howled through the trees surrounding Willow's Edge, carrying with them a sense of unease. The farm, usually a place of quiet solitude, now seemed small under the vast, shadowed sky. Grant sat on the porch, staring out toward the barn, his mind churning with worry. Inside, he knew Havoc was restless, pacing, shifting his massive form behind the dim glow of the stable light. Mara joined him, her arms wrapped tightly in a shawl, her face drawn with exhaustion. "This farm is barely holding on," she said softly, her words heavy with concern. "One more mistake, one more bad investment, and we're done." Grant exhaled deeply, his shoulders tense. "I know," he muttered, "but he's not just a horse, Mara. He's something more." Mara sighed, frustration seeping into her voice. "Just don't let him take us down with him," she said, her gaze searching Grant's face. The weight of her words lingered in the cool night air, and Grant didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. Not when everything felt so uncertain. The next morning, as the sun rose in muted shades of gray, Grant found something that chilled him to his core. Tracks, human tracks, near the barn. The dirt had been disturbed, and the footprints led into the woods at the edge of the property. Havoc's not the only restless one around here, Grant muttered to himself, a sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. Owen, holding a bucket of oats, stood nearby. "What is it, Dad?" the boy asked, his voice quiet, sensing something was off. "Nothing," Grant said quickly, brushing it off, though his mind churned. Who had been near the barn, and why? That night, Havoc's restless behavior intensified. The horse stamped his hooves, his ears flicking constantly toward the forest, his body tense and alert. It was as though the horse could hear something, something the rest of them couldn't. At just past midnight, a frantic, piercing whinny shattered the silence, rousing Grant from a restless sleep. Grabbing a flashlight, he bolted outside, with Mara and Owen trailing behind him. The barn door had swung wide open, and the paddock gate lay broken, the latch snapped clean off. Havoc stood near the edge of the enclosure, his massive frame silhouetted against the dim light of early morning. Grant's flashlight beam caught fresh footprints, human footprints, leading into the woods. "Not good," Grant muttered, his voice tight with urgency. Grant's boots crunched over the dry dirt as he approached Havoc, whose dark eyes locked onto him with a mix of wariness and trust. The horse stood rigid, his body tense and ready to spring at the first sign of danger. "Morning, big guy," Grant said, keeping his voice low and steady. He didn't want to spook him again. The past few days had been a battle, and this was the moment where everything could either fall apart or begin to heal. Slowly, carefully, Grant held out his hand, palm open, with the coiled rope resting loosely in his other hand. "No tricks. Just you and me figuring this out." Havoc didn't move. The horse's eyes were fixed on Grant, his stance still guarded. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and the silence stretched between them. It felt like an eternity before Havoc took one cautious step forward, then another. Grant's heart leapt as the horse slowly closed the gap between them, his gaze never wavering. He was close now, so close that Grant could feel the heat radiating from the horse's body. But just as Havoc reached the edge of the rope's length, a loud, sharp crack split the air, the barn door slamming shut in the wind. Havoc's reaction was instant and violent. The horse reared up, hooves flailing as he shot backward in a desperate panic. Grant barely managed to dodge the kick, stumbling backward and landing hard on the ground. Havoc's eyes rolled wildly, and before Grant could recover, the horse was already galloping along the fence line, moving like a storm unleashed. Back inside the farmhouse, Mara was waiting, the warmth of the kitchen contrasting with the tension outside. The smell of fresh coffee and biscuits filled the air, but it did little to soften her expression when Grant walked in. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said, her voice clipped, as she handed him a towel to wipe the dirt off his face. The concern in her voice was unmistakable. "He's getting better," Grant replied, though the ache in his back begged to differ. "Better?" Mara raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Better?" she echoed. "He nearly took your head off. How was that better?" "He's scared, not angry, scared." Her words were heavy with concern. "And you think you can fix that?" Grant sighed, leaning against the counter. He didn't have an answer that would satisfy her, but he knew one thing for sure. There was something about Havoc, something deep inside that Grant had yet to understand fully. Later that day, Owen found himself standing at the edge of the paddock, watching Havoc from a distance. The horse had settled in a far corner, grazing but restless. His movements were cautious, his ears flicking toward every sound. Owen hesitated, then leaned against the fence. "You're not so scary as you look," Owen said quietly under his breath, more to himself than to the horse. To his surprise, Havoc lifted his head and fixed Owen with a steady gaze. Owen's breath caught, his heart racing as the horse's eyes locked onto his. For a long moment, it felt as though time stood still. Then, almost as if considering the boy, Havoc let out a low, questioning snort before turning away. It was a breakthrough, small but significant. Owen, still unsure of the horse, felt a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. The fear was fading, replaced by something else entirely. Later that week, as Grant was driving into town, a question gnawed at him. He needed answers. He needed to know more about Havoc's past. The horse's restlessness, the strange marks on the gate, the odd behavior that seemed so different from other horses he'd encountered. It was all connected, and Grant was determined to uncover the truth. At the feed store, Grant spotted Jim Mercer, an old trainer who had long since retired. Jim had seen it all, and Grant knew he could trust him with what was happening on the farm. "Jim, you ever heard of a horse named Havoc?" Grant asked as he approached the counter. Jim's face darkened, and he let out a low whistle. "Yeah, I've heard of him," he said, his voice low. "What's it to you?" Grant leaned in closer, his voice urgent. "I've got him now," he said quietly. Jim's expression softened, and he shook his head. "You're braver than I thought. Or stupider," he muttered, looking Grant over. "That horse has been through hell." Grant felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What kind of hell?" he pressed. Jim's eyes lowered, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Underground racing circuit," he said grimly. "The worst of the worst. They pushed those horses till they broke. Whips, drugs, you name it." His gaze turned distant, lost in memory. Havoc survived a fire. The stable went up in flames, but he made it out. His partner didn't. A mare they were bonded to. It destroyed him. Grant's chest tightened as he absorbed the information. Havoc hadn't just been a victim of cruelty. He'd also lost someone dear to him. The image of the terrified horse, alone and afraid, filled Grant's mind. He couldn't shake the thought. That night, Havoc's agitation returned. He paced the paddock relentlessly, his head jerking up at every faint sound. Grant stayed by the fence, flashlight in hand, scanning the shadows. He wasn't sure what he was looking for until the beam caught something. A mark, jagged and almost careless, carved into the gate. The shape was unmistakable, a symbol Grant had seen before on a neighbor's property after their prized horse had disappeared. His heart sank as the realization hit. The mark was tied to the illegal racing circuit. It was a warning, or a claim, left by someone who had no intention of letting Havoc go free. Just then, Havoc let out a sharp whinny, his body rigid as he stared down the road. Grant followed the horse's gaze and saw a figure emerging from the darkness. "Evening, Grant," came the casual voice of Ethan Corbin, his tone smooth but his eyes sharp. "Nice night, isn't it?" Grant's grip tightened on the flashlight as Havoc's reaction was immediate. The horse's ears pinned back, and he reared slightly, his body shaking with tension. "What do you want, Ethan?" Grant asked, his voice low. Ethan smirked, his gaze flicking toward the mark on the gate before returning to Grant. "Heard you got yourself a new horse," Ethan said, the words dripping with mockery. "Thought I'd stop by and see him." Grant stepped closer, his stance protective. "He's not for sale," he said firmly. Ethan's smile didn't falter. "Who said anything about buying?" he replied smoothly. "But if you're interested, I could make you a good offer. That kind of horse? He's more trouble than he's worth." Grant's jaw tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. "He's worth plenty to me." Ethan's smile tightened, and he shrugged. "Animals like him don't just forget where they've been. You keep him around, and you might find yourself in more trouble than you bargained for." Grant stepped closer, his voice hardening. "What do you know about where he's been?" Ethan's eyes flickered for a split second, but he quickly masked his reaction. "Just what I've heard," he said, his tone casual. "Take care, Grant." As Ethan turned to leave, Grant called after him. "You've seen him before, haven't you?" Ethan paused, his smile faltering before he quickly masked it. "Maybe," he replied, then turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Grant standing there, the weight of his words lingering in the air. Later that night, Grant sat at the kitchen table, studying a piece of wood he'd pried from the paddock gate. The jagged mark was unmistakable, another crude symbol tied to the underground racing circuit. Ethan wasn't just a stranger. He was connected to this dark past, and now Grant realized that he was involved in something far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Mara entered the room carrying a steaming mug of tea. "What are you muttering about now?" she asked, noticing the intensity in Grant's face. He held up the wood, the mark carved into it. "This was on the gate," he said. "It's a warning or a claim, and Ethan knows more than he's letting on." Mara's frown deepened as she gazed toward the darkened window. "You think he's dangerous?" Grant didn't hesitate. "I know he is," he replied grimly. The danger Grant had suspected soon became undeniable. Just a few nights later, the air was thick with tension. Grant woke to the frantic sound of Havoc's whinnying, a cry that shattered the stillness of the night, piercing through the walls of the farmhouse. His heart pounded as he grabbed his flashlight and dashed outside. The barn door was ajar, swaying in the wind, and the paddock gate was wide open, the latch broken, just as it had been before. Havoc stood near the edge of the paddock, his massive body tense and his head held high, as though he sensed something Grant couldn't yet see. His ears were flattened against his skull, his nostrils flaring as he snorted in agitation. Grant's flashlight swept across the area, catching a glimmer of someone in the dark. Ethan Corbin. The man stood in the shadows, crowbar in hand, poised to strike at Havoc's stall. His actions were deliberate, as though he intended to take the horse from them once and for all. "What the hell are you doing?" Grant shouted, his voice sharp with fury. Ethan spun around, his face twisted with anger. "You don't know what you're messing with, Holloway," he spat. "That horse is a liability. I'm doing you a favor by putting him down." Before Grant could react, Havoc's stall door burst open with a violent force. The horse reared up, his hooves slamming into the ground with a deafening crash. He charged, surging forward with a power that made the earth tremble beneath him. Ethan stumbled back, dropping the crowbar in fear as Havoc advanced. The horse's eyes blazed with fury, his body moving like a storm, every muscle taut with purpose. The men who had accompanied Ethan tried to react, but their bravado crumbled as Havoc bore down on them, driving them toward the paddock. The other horses, disturbed by the chaos, joined in, their hooves pounding the ground in unison as they moved in tandem with Havoc's charge. Ethan shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the commotion. The horse had become a force of nature, unstoppable, unrelenting. One of Ethan's men bolted toward the truck, fear in his eyes. The others weren't so quick. Havoc cornered them, his massive frame casting a shadow over their retreat. And as the men stumbled back, Grant stepped forward. With a shovel in hand, Grant positioned himself between Ethan and Havoc. His voice was calm but firm. "This ends here," he said, his eyes locked onto Ethan's. Ethan hesitated, glancing back at the truck, clearly calculating his next move. He had no intention of giving up so easily, but Havoc wasn't done yet. The horse took another step forward, his breath visible in the cold night air. It was clear he wouldn't back down. Ethan's face twisted with rage as he spat. "You're making a mistake, Holloway," but began to retreat, his feet stumbling as he quickly backed away. "No," Grant said firmly. "You did." As Ethan and his men retreated into the night, Grant stood, his body tense, his chest heavy with relief. The danger was not over, but for now, they had won. As the figures disappeared into the darkness, Grant looked back at Havoc, whose wild eyes had begun to calm. The horse stood still, his breath coming in heavy, controlled gusts, and his powerful body was relaxed for the first time in days. The following morning, the sheriff arrived, his car parked near the barn with its flashing lights casting long shadows across the farm. Owen stood nearby, holding a stack of papers he had found buried in an old trunk in the barn. The records contained names, dates, and photographs, proof of the underground racing circuit that had tied Ethan and others to Havoc's painful past. "This is enough to bring charges," the sheriff said grimly as he flipped through the pages, his face hardening. Grant felt a weight lift off his chest. The nightmare wasn't over, but the wheels of justice were finally turning. Ethan would face the consequences of his actions. Mara stood beside Grant, her hand gripping his arm. You did it, she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Grant glanced toward the paddock, where Havoc stood calm and unshaken, his eyes peaceful for the first time since he had arrived on their farm. We did it, he said quietly. In the weeks that followed, word spread throughout the town about the events at the Holloway farm. Neighbors who had once mocked Grant now came by, their tones respectful, even apologetic. The horse that had been nothing but a symbol of chaos and danger had become something else entirely, a symbol of resilience, of survival against all odds. Havoc's story was shared at feed stores and town gatherings, and Grant's determination was admired. Owen spent more time with Havoc, brushing his coat and feeding him treats. The fear he had once felt had slowly been replaced by quiet admiration. One afternoon, Owen stood beside the paddock, resting a hand on Havoc's shoulder. You're not so bad, he said softly. Havoc snorted, leaning into the boy's touch, and for the first time, Grant smiled with a sense of quiet pride. He had fought for this, fought for the horse, for his family and for the farm, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were all standing on solid ground. The seasons changed, and with them, the Holloway farm began to flourish once more. The fields that had once been barren sprouted green, and the barn, now repaired, stood as a testament to perseverance. Grant often found himself standing by the paddock, watching Havoc gallop freely across the open field. There was a joy in the horse's movements, a freedom that hadn't been there before. One crisp autumn morning, Grant opened the paddock gate and watched as Havoc bolted into the larger field. The horse paused for a moment, ears flicking at the wind, and then took off, his powerful legs carrying him across the land in a blur of black. Grant watched him go, a deep sense of peace settling over him. Havoc had brought chaos into their lives, yes, but he had also brought purpose. And in the end, Grant realized they had saved each other. As Havoc disappeared over the horizon, his mane flowing like a dark river under the setting sun, Grant leaned against the fence, a quiet smile on his face. The farm had faced storms, some literal, others figurative, but today it stood stronger than ever, just like the people and animals who called it home.